Thank you very much for joining us for Language and Identity series. I am Maria TELEGINA, a postdoctoral fellow at Tokyo College and a moderator of today's session. Today, Michael HOFMEYR and Naoko HOSOKAWA will discuss recent policy reforms in English language education towards a new generation of bilingual and multicultural Japanese. Most of us encountered English in our lives in some shape or form. And for many of us who are not born in English-speaking environment, the first encounter with English happens at school as a language learner. And it is a crucial moment. Working knowledge of English might broaden the person's perspective on the world and even add some aspects to their identity, like being able to work abroad or to identify with a wider global community. Format of today's session will be slightly different from the formats of other sessions in this series, as two of the speakers are actually co-investigators in the project on the topic they will be discussing. So both of them will give some input on the issue on recent policy reforms in English education and discuss it together at the end of the session. Michael HOFMEYR will talk about past and present of English language education in Japan, and then Naoko HOSOKAWA will connect it to the future plans and perspectives. Michael HOFMEYR is a specially appointed associate professor at Osaka University, where he teaches courses in English communication and general linguistics. He has worked in the field of foreign language education for over 10 years, mainly at high school and university level in Japan, and has published research articles and book chapters on computer-assisted language learning, innovative approaches for teaching critical thinking in an English as a foreign language context, and linguistic diversity in Japan. He's currently pursuing a doctoral degree in applied linguistics at Kyoto University. Naoko HOSOKAWA is a postdoctoral fellow at Tokyo College at the University of Tokyo. She conducted her PhD project on the debates over the use of loanwords and national identity in Japan at the Faculty of Oriental Studies, the University of Oxford. And she has been interested in the question of language and identity, in particular in relation to the use of loanwords, metaphors, linguistic diversity, and language education. With Michael, she has been working on the collaborative project on language education and identity that they will present on today. So now, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Maria. And yes, I'll just share my slides here quickly. Okay, so you can see my slides?
Yes.
All right, so then I'll begin my part of the presentation. So as Maria has said, I will introduce our project. So maybe full disclosure right at the start. The project is still in its initial stages, so we've only just been making plans, and Naoko has started to do some initial research that she will present, but it's still very much in the planning phase. So for my part of the for this presentation, I will basically give some historical background about English in Japan and English education in Japan, and then also some information about the reforms that we've been seeing over recent decades in the way English is taught in Japan in the school system. And just a little bit about our collaboration then. I am working currently at Osaka University, but my background is working as a language teacher. I've taught at high school and also at university for several years in Japan. So I will come at this research project from a second language acquisition and a teacher's perspective. And Naoko will then, she's more interested in the identity side of it from a socio-linguistic perspective. So just as a brief overview of what I'll be talking about, I'll present some information on the historical background on English education in Japan and the English language in Japan. And then I'll talk a little bit about about an assessment of the English education system to see how well it is currently working and has been working over the past decades. And then I'll discuss some specific obstacles to successful language learning and attempts that have been made by the government to reform the language education system. And I'll also talk about maybe some reasons for thinking that the system may be improved in the future, and then talk about some of the ideas of specific issues related to these reforms that Naoko and I are interested in researching for our project. So first of all, I thought I'd just show you the slide because I thought it was interesting. This shows the meeting of, the first meeting of William Adams, who was an English sailor shipwrecked on the coast of Kyushu in the year 1600, so more than 400 years ago, and meeting Japanese daimyo, or Japanese leader at the time. And this is the first recorded incident of the use of the English language in Japan. But if you know a little about the history of Japan, you'll know that for about 250 years, almost 250 years of the Edo period, from about 1600 to late in the 9th, or to past the middle of the 19th century, the Tokugawa shogunate followed a policy of national isolation, or sakoku, right, as a way to defend Japan against European colonial expansion. So as a result of that, there was almost no contact with England or with English-speaking countries over that period. So English had almost no role at all in Japan over that period. But then this all changed in the mid-19th century when Japan's borders were forced open by the United States, and which started this period of radical reform, of modernization, of the Meiji Restoration, right, the Meiji period, when there were very large political changes in Japan, and Japan rapidly modernized and industrialized. And ever since that time, English in Japan has been strongly associated with modernization and progress. And Japan's government has recognized the importance and the strategic importance as well of the English language, and of having Japanese people who can communicate in English. So, for example, in 1873, Mori Arinori, who would later become who was a major figure in the Meiji Japanese government, and he would later become the first Minister of Education. And he would also implement compulsory elementary school education at that time. He wrote about the absolute necessity of mastering the English language. And he was quite a radical in his ideas. So his suggestion was that the Japanese language should be entirely abolished and replaced with English as Japan's national language. And as you probably know, this never happened, but it was quite seriously discussed by some members of the intellectual elite of Japan at that time, and of the government. So here's a photo of Mori Arinori. And then so up to the Second World War, English was taught in Japan in some capacity, especially among the elites. It was not uncommon to study English. But then in the years leading up to the Second World War, with America and the West seen as the enemy, the use of English and the Roman alphabet was officially discouraged by the government, but English continued to be taught at schools in Japan up to the Second World War, and also during. And then following the Second World War, during the occupation period in 1947, when Japan's new constitution, post-war constitution, was drawn up, the education system was also drastically reformed. And the new education system that was adopted was modeled on the American system, with 6 years of elementary school followed by 3 years of junior high school and then 3 years of senior high school. And then compulsory education was increased from 6 years to 9 years. And English education, or at least foreign language education, but in practice this was almost always English, then became compulsory at the years of junior high school. So so everyone had to study English for at least 3 years. So in that really brought English to the masses in Japan. So it wasn't just an elite language to learn anymore, but everyone had to learn some English. And then many people also continued to study English at senior high school after the Second World War. So if we look at the progression rate from junior high school to senior high school in 1950, it was 36%. But by 1970, it was 90% of children who finished the compulsory education went on to senior high school, so extra 3 years as well, where they studied English. And currently, almost everyone, all of the children in Japan continue up to senior high school. And in effect, then everyone studies English for probably at least 6 years at school, and it's also not uncommon for elementary schools to offer English classes. And then, in addition to the radical educational reforms that I talked about in the Meiji period and the U.S. occupation period, in the 1980s, there was a drive from Prime Minister Nakasone towards policies of internationalization, or kokusaika. And this also had a significant impact on how English language education happens in Japan today. Because it was mainly for economic reasons. He wanted closer ties with America, and he thought this would be one way in which to foster those closer ties would be to initiate programs like the JET program. So we have the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program that was established in 1987. And this involved thousands of young people from other countries. Currently over 50 countries are participating, but it's still predominantly from the US and from English-speaking countries, coming to Japan and working at public schools here as assistant language teachers, or ALTs. And this program is still ongoing. I think there are about maybe around 5,000 or 6,000 JETs in Japan at the moment still, and the annual budget is in the vicinity of 45 billion yen, so about $500 million. So it's a very substantial amount of money that the government is investing in that. Then in 2000, Prime Minister Obuchi suggested that English be made an official language of Japan, not in this case abolishing or at the expense of Japanese, but alongside Japanese, right? But this proposal was rejected following criticism, maybe from nationalists, and also because it was expected to cost a lot of money to implement. And then just some other information about English in Japan. University entrance examinations, which are very important in the Japanese education system, because the gatekeepers they act as gatekeepers to the top universities, and then the most prestigious employers tend to hire graduates from the top universities. And all of these universities have entrance examinations, and English is a very common subject that's also evaluated at these entrance examinations. So it's taken very seriously by students at school, their English scores, and their ability to pass these examinations. And also many employers ask for certification of English proficiency. And some employers, famously Rakuten and Uniqlo, have made English the official language of their companies. So in theory, at least, all employees, even if it's in the Japanese head office and most people working there are Japanese, they need to speak English and use English at work. So, and then finally, outside of the public education system, there's also a thriving private sector English language education industry. And this was, so for example, cram schools where children go after school to take extra lessons, and also English conversation schools that are popular with adults, eikaiwa schools. And these are estimated to have a market size together of over 300 billion yen. So also a very large amount of money although it's quite difficult to estimate, and the different estimates you will find sometimes go up to much higher than this amount. So then, okay, so we've seen so far that English has for a long time been a priority of the Japanese government, and that a lot of investment has taken place from the side of the government, and also private citizens willing to pay for extra English classes. But how well does the English education system work? Well, first of all, maybe it's worth just looking at the overall results of the education system in Japan. So in general, Japan's education system, or public education system, which the vast majority of people go to the children go to public schools in Japan, it's seen as a success story. If we look at international benchmark tests of attainment at school, like the PISA tests or the TIMSS tests, then we see Japan is ranked in mathematics, number 6th out of 79 countries in PISA, and in the TIMSS test, 4th out of 64. So it's usually in the top 5 or the top 10 in these international rankings. And also for science, Japan scores very high. So it's considered to have one of the best public education systems in the world overall, and is often praised for that in the academic literature, and admired for that. However, outcomes for English education have been notably less positive. So while most Japanese adults today have studied English for at least 6 years at school, and many for more, and also outside of school, it seems like very few have the ability to and the confidence to use English as a language for practical communication. And this is an impression I think that many tourists visiting Japan get very quickly, and it's also an impression that people working in English language education, like myself here, get very quickly. But it's sometimes disputed, maybe out of professional pride by language teachers working here, or for a variety of reasons. So I thought I'd just collect a little bit of evidence to support this statement or this claim. First of all, from scholarly publications, we've got Rowland, who in 1983 wrote a very well-known book on the Japanese education system. So he says well, this is a little bit outdated, but he said most Japanese can read English with amazing skill, but hardly speak a word. And then in other newer sources, including in a Japanese source, it's often it's not difficult to find quotes along these lines that Japanese people in general can't speak English very well. And then also newspaper articles in the English language press about whenever publications in Japan in English, in like the Japan Times or Japan Today newspapers, it's very common to see articles along the lines of this one: why Japan's English education is a fiasco. In general, it's presented in very negative terms, and maybe the Japanese newspapers, the headlines don't seem as overtly critical, but also the general feeling seems to be that the system is not very successful. And then my third source was to look at travel guides, and then you could also find quotes like these ones: few Japanese are comfortable with everyday spoken English, or it's rare to find people who are conversant in English. And then I think I should go a little bit quicker here because I don't have much time. But international standardized tests of English proficiency also support this conclusion. If we look at the TOEFL IBT test, which is a very popular international standardized test of English proficiency, which measures reading, listening, speaking, and writing skills, and we compare Japan to other Asian countries, we see that Japan's score is much lower than comparable countries like China and South Korea. Both of those scored in the middle high 80s, and Japan scored in the low 70s. And its rank in Asia is 27th out of 28, which basically puts it in the same level of proficiency as Francophone African countries like Burkina Faso and the Democratic Republic of Congo, which of course are developing countries with much fewer lower levels of government support and so on, and resources to rely on in the education system. So this seems very surprising. The EF Education First English Proficiency Index shows a similar result. So then, to summarize, the most adults in Japan have studied English for at least 6 years at school, probably more. And the Japanese government takes internationalization and English language education very seriously. Universities require it, employers require it. And there's a huge private sector English education industry as well, and it's thriving. So in spite of this, most people don't seem to be able to speak English very well. So what is going on, right? And that's, I think, something that puzzles many people working in the field of language education in Japan, and a lot's been written about it. So then here is just a very quick overview of some of the commonly cited obstacles to successful language learning in Japan. So here are 4 points provided by Aspinall. The first important point is that Japanese and English are very different languages. They have very different syntactic structures, very different vocabulary, and very different sound systems. So it's a very difficult task, and a task that takes a long time to learn Japanese, or to learn English if you're a Japanese speaker, or to learn Japanese for that matter if you're an English speaker. So it's unfair to compare it to the situation of American children, for example, learning Spanish. And then also business is usually done in Japanese only, even at big Japanese companies in Japan, and people can go about their daily lives without really using English at all. There's a huge translation industry, for example. So films are translated, books are translated. So this leads many learners to feel, well, why should I learn English? I could get by just fine without it. So they're often unmotivated. And then there's what's called the washback effect. So the university entrance examinations tend to test reading skills in English and listening skills in English, but not productive skills, not writing and speaking. So as a result, the school teachers, perhaps they would like to teach communicative English, but they simply don't feel like they have the time. They feel like they need to prioritize the skills that will be assessed on the university entrance examination, which is so important to these children. So they use the traditional grammar translation method of teaching very often. And this enables learners to develop very good reading skills, so they can often read and understand very complex passages, but they find it very difficult to speak, or they might not develop the skills to speak comfortably. And then there are also cultural factors at play. So Japan is, or the Japanese classroom environment is often characterized as collectivist and egalitarian. And this means that students sometimes may be reluctant to speak English in front of their peers, especially when they feel like they will be perceived as sort of show-offs, or ones who are better than their friends, or trying to look like they're smarter than their friends. So then the stronger students will often not get the practice they need because they will be too reluctant to speak in class. And also there's maybe a tradition or a feeling among many students at school that every question has one correct answer. And in case of language learning, that can make students quite risk averse. If they don't know the exact answer that's written in the textbook, they might talk to their friends in Japanese for a long time in the class without wanting to say an answer if they're not 100% sure it's correct, which can be quite frustrating in a language learning environment if the students don't want to take any risks, because that's how we believe languages are learned, right? Through making mistakes and then maybe getting corrective feedback and then internalizing that feedback so that you can improve your mastery of the language. And then other factors might be the limited number of classroom hours available for foreign language education, the fact that many elementary and junior high school teachers don't have very high English proficiency to begin with in the Japanese school. So it's difficult for them to be role models or act as role models. They might also, children often, especially in the countryside, have very limited opportunity to practice communicative English in their daily lives. And then there's also an issue of linguistic, what's been called linguistic imperialism, like English being perceived as a threat to Japanese national identity or Japanese national interests. And for that reason, some people are cautious of this idea of Japanese people speaking English too well, that it might threaten their Japanese identity. And then to talk just very briefly about some reforms to the system. So over the years, MEXT, or the Japanese Ministry of Education, they've been launching new initiatives and reforming their approaches to language teaching in attempts to deal with these problems. So, and as I said before, the JET program was founded, and then from 2002, they published a series of papers. The first one was entitled Developing a Strategic Plan to Cultivate Japanese with English Abilities. So here they set out practical plans for improving learner outcomes, and also provided assurances that Japanese national identity will be maintained with this new focus on communicative teaching. And then the center test for university admission also introduced an English listening component, and teachers' guides to teaching English in the public school system were revised to advise teachers to use the English language to teach English. So basically, don't explain English rules or examples in Japanese, but communicate actually with the students in English. And this was first done at the senior high school level, and later in 2016 junior high schools as well. And then in English lessons for all 5th and 6th graders at elementary school became compulsory in 2011, and the latest reforms in 2020, which we're particularly interested in, significantly increased the number of teaching hours of English for English at elementary schools from 70 hours over 2 years to 210 hours over 4 years. So that's quite a substantial increase. And it would be interesting to see how this affects learning outcomes then. So reasons for optimism: the government continues to provide generous funding and generous support for English learning initiatives. So we know there's some financial commitment from the government and the Ministry of Education. And then the policy documents recommend that teachers follow a more communicative language teaching approach, which is currently considered best practice internationally in terms of language education as well. And then the policy documents also stress the importance of maintaining Japanese cultural identity or national identity, and I think this is consistent with this idea of fostering bilingualism without giving up your first language or your first language identity, as David Crystal recommends in his English as a Global Language. And then also teaching children at a younger age to speak, as often in other countries, led to better outcomes in terms of communicative competence. And this could also happen with these with the latest round of reforms. And according to a recent paper, or recent study, most Japanese high school, junior and senior high school teachers are now willing to teach at least part of their classes in English, which is also a step in the right direction. And finally, MEXT has been trying to implement speaking and writing tests as well for the center test. It's been abandoned for now, but they've shown willingness to reform the university entrance examination system, and I think that's also an important step in the right direction. So there might be reason to think that in the future the situation will improve. So I think I have to finish, but just some questions that we're interested in looking at for the project that I'm doing with Naoko now is how consistent are the stated learning aims and pedagogical recommendations described in these MEXT documents that have been published over the last 20 years? Then how likely are the strategic plans described in the MEXT policy documents to reach the stated learning aims, given the constraints posed by the Japanese education system in its current form? So are these reforms realistic and these policy goals even realistic? How likely are the most recent reforms of significantly increasing the number of hours of English education at the elementary level to substantially improve learners' communicative competence in English? So maybe at the hand of SLA theory, or with using some second language acquisition theory and linguistic theory, we can look at how, again, how realistic or how well informed pedagogically these reforms are. And then Naoko's topic, how likely are the recent reforms to influence identity formation in learners? So will it push them more towards an English identity, or to have a multicultural identity encompassing English and Japanese? And then also, what's been the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the implementation of these reforms? Because they were slated, the latest round, to be implemented in 2020. So that's exactly at the time of the start of the pandemic. So we thought that would be interesting as well. And then that's the end of my part. So thank you very much for your attention. You're welcome to email me with comments or questions. And now we'll hand over to Naoko.
So thank you very much, Michael. And I will continue our presentation on this project on the second part. So I will share my screen. I think you can see my screen now. So now Michael has mentioned this English language education reform, and I'll look at this reform from the perspective of implications for identity formation. So as he mentioned, that this English education reform corresponds to this idea of the globalization, which has been on a big agenda for the Japanese government since 2000s. And this full-scale implementation has happened in 2020, and they gave important landmarks. It's 2020, which was last year, which was supposed to be the year for Olympic Games and Paralympic Games, and 2050, which is the time when the current school children would be working and making a difference as stakeholders in the society in their 30s and 40s. And their objective is defined as developing global human resource who can use English as an international lingua franca. However, as Michael has also mentioned, the important thing is not only improve the English competence in Japanese educational system, but also to develop Japanese identity. So in addition to the increase of English class hours, we have also witnessed the increase of 84 hours and 35 hours for Japanese class in elementary school and junior high school, respectively. And there has been an emphasis on classical literature, literary materials in Japanese, and increased number of activities using the Japanese language. So we can say that there has been much more hours to learn Japanese cultural heritage in addition to English classes. So in terms of the question between English education and Japanese identity, there have been quite a few studies already since this idea had been placed since late 1990s and 2000s. And it has been pointed out that actually internationalization of education can lead to Japanization of Japanese learning of English, because it has been pointed out that Japan is the country in which national identity constitutes a key idea in language education. So language education reform has always accompanied by Japanese language education and also the teaching of Japaneseness and Japanese culture and values. So it seems to us that this goal of language education reform is actually to foster Japanese who can play a role in the global society while maintaining Japanese values and identity, which is the part which is very important in the reform plan. So we understood this basic idea for the English education reform plan, and I wondered how this plan is implemented and reflected in everyday classroom in English education. So I looked at some English textbooks in Japan since the post-war period, 1949 to this year, 2021, focusing on two publishing companies, Tokyo Shoseki and Kairyudo, who have the largest share of English textbooks currently in Japanese schools. And just to mention that the Japanese textbooks used in public schools are all screened by the government. And I looked both at the level of junior high school and elementary school, focusing on these textbooks: New Horizon Elementary, New Horizon English course, Junior Sunshine, Junior English, Sunshine English course, as well as Jack and Betty English Step by Step, which is the oldest textbooks after the war used in Japan. And I mainly focused on chapter themes, main characters, and images used in the textbooks. So I don't have the time to introduce all the details of these textbooks because there are quite a few number of textbooks issued between these years. But I will first introduce the first textbook I looked at, which is Jack and Betty English Step by Step, which is issued by Kairyudo. And at the time of the first publication, 1949, this had by far the largest share of English textbook in Japan, which was about 80%. And the Kairyudo English textbook still has the second largest share in English textbooks currently, which accounts for about 1/4 of all the textbooks used in public schools. And as the title suggests, Jack and Betty is textbook in which main characters are Jack Jones and Betty Smith, who are two Americans. And these are the stories about middle school people in Illinois, United States. And all the main characters are all American. And in the first edition, there is no Japanese character represented, even though it has been mentioned that after 1965, there is a character who is a Japanese student temporarily studying abroad in the US, but it is characterized as a temporary visitor to the States. And at the end of the story, the student is going back to Japan. So there's this temporal element to this Japanese character. So the main chapter themes of this very early textbook of Japanese English in Japan include Independence Day, and visiting from New York, Thanksgiving Day, Christmas party, cousin from Florida, Lincoln's birthday, as well as Robert Burns' poems. So we can see that it is very much focused on American culture and a little bit of British culture. So it has been pointed out that in this post-war period, actually the strong focus on the democracy. And they use this American culture as a model of democracy. And it was important for the students to learn the culture of English-speaking countries, particularly American culture. So the central focus was to understand and appreciate the lifestyle, manners, and customs of people who are speaking English as its first language, mainly in UK and US. And the governmental guideline issued in 1951 says the pupils should be taught to follow British and American customs in all activities in English classes. So this has a very strong focus on learning the American culture and British culture. So this element, this tendency was kept pretty much in 1950s and 60s. And we see this textbook, for example, issued in 1966, which includes chapter themes like April Fool's Day, leaving for England, schools in England, Shakespeare's work, Paris, Switzerland, New York City, Thanksgiving Day. So we see that there are mentions of some of the non-English speaking countries like Paris, Switzerland. So, but we can see that focus is still very much on the Western countries, and especially these stories are told from the perspective of an American person visiting Switzerland or visiting Paris. So in this story, this Dr. Smith, who is American, who visits England for a conference. So this setting is very much American point of view. And the textbook in 1977, we still see quite a lot of references to these Western countries, even though there's little by little, there are some references to Japanese situation. And in 1970s textbook, we start to see some stories about weather station in Mount Fuji, or Japanese authors' work, such as The Spider's Thread by Akutagawa. And there are some students talking about countries other than English-speaking, Japanese student talking about Japan, Norwegian students speaking about Norway. And 1990s started to see a quite radical change in terms of English education. And this was just after Nakasone's internationalization project that Michael has just mentioned. And then on the first page, they speak about Japan in the world as a kind of big slogan. And you see a lot of photos from other countries. And their focus is about Japanese students going to study in the US or volunteering abroad, or photos of the US conference in Brazil that kind of inspires students to start looking abroad. So the focus started to be more of the Japanese going abroad to become international. And also there has been a focus on the diversity and inclusiveness, showing some Japanese composer being very active in international stage with some visual impairment, or some first female actor of kyogen, which is Japanese traditional theater, who is women. So this kind of focus in inclusiveness has become very important as well. And we can also see in 1990s that the focus point has changed, and there has been introduction of American person visiting Japan on holiday and the Japanese person showing them around. So idea is showing Japan to the people from other country. And there has also been a text about Ainu people, so some diversity within Japan, text about the Hiroshima during the World War II. So there has been this focus of things that Japan should present towards the world. So this has been the shift of perspective quite visible in 1990s, and there has been some emphasis on gender neutral expression, for example. So point of view has become quite international. So this kind of changes can be confirmed in the governmental guideline issued in 1999, that English classes became officially compulsory, even though it was compulsory de facto, compulsory since early years. And also emphasis in communication, which Michael has just mentioned as well. And listening comprehension was more emphasized. And the order of the names has changed to Japanese names. So not the first name first, but the family name first style, to respect the cultural element of Japanese people. And in 2000s, this tendency has been even more emphasized, that they started talking about my country, so introducing Japan, and also talking about other Asian countries. There's a text about Bangladesh, and also there's text about American person learning rakugo, which is Japanese traditional culture. So focusing on people who are learning Japanese culture rather than Japanese person only learning about American culture or British culture. So this tendency continued, and we have seen this reform in 2020, and these are the things that I have found in the textbooks after the implementation of the reform. So junior high school textbook, there have been much more Japanese characters represented, and of course names, Japanese names written in the Japanese order, and characters with double nationality, some characters from Asian countries, and a lot of characters based in Japan. So this has been another big change, especially after the reform, that the people are speaking in the Japanese setting instead of going abroad. And foreigners are not only visiting Japan, but actually living in Japan. So this is a difference between the textbooks, for example, from 90s, where people are coming to Japan just for holiday, but it portrays Japanese society with foreign people living in Japan. And there are quite a lot of focus on activities to introduce Japan or talk about Japanese culture in English, and debating exercise about whether Japan is a good place to live, and a lot of things around Japanese culture. And I looked also at the elementary school textbook, which was also very interesting. So there are quite similar features to the junior high school textbook, that there are Japanese characters, more Japanese characters represented, and In addition to Americans or Canadians, there are some Asian characters like Singaporean, and there are some ideas of non-English languages. So some of the greetings in other languages are represented in textbooks as well. And there is a whole chapter to introduce Japan. So introducing Japan in English has become a very important theme in English education, which confirms this idea of maintaining Japanese identity while fostering a global human resource. And there is this very important slogan of welcome to Japan repeated in the textbook, which implies that characters are in Japan receiving people from other countries rather than going abroad from Japan, going out of Japan. And the second textbook, which is from Tokyo Soseki New Horizons Elementary School, has a very similar feature as well. There are more Japanese characters, and the Singaporean and Brazilian, so non-Anglophone countries as well, and Asian countries as well. And as was the case with Kairyudo textbook, there was a whole chapter to introduce Japan, and there was this big important slogan of welcome to Japan and the column to talk about charms of Japan. So the emphasis is finding Japanese culture as an international heritage. And also emphasis was also on global diversity. However, there has been some photos of a very conformist, typical looking of Japanese junior high school students. So there seem to be a little bit of contrast between this global diversity versus Japanese classroom. So the characteristics of 2021 textbooks, many more countries have been represented, and clear emphasis, especially in the first fifth grade, so the first year in which the English language classes are compulsory, there has been a very strong focus in Japanese culture. And the main theme in the fifth year is like living in Japan. And then sixth grade, they start talking about living in the world. And the conversation happening in Japan with the people living in Japan from different countries. And therefore, the many examples are in the Japanese context. So people, they are talking about many more Japanese, and prices are written in Japanese yen, and the place names are more from Japan. And they often talk about Japanese foreign characters with a special interest in Japan. So emphasizing that a lot of people are interested in Japanese culture, even though one thing which was quite remarkable was that their focus was very much on the traditional culture of Japan, which is haiku, rakugo, kyogen, the theater, the literature, all traditional culture, and not so much reference to the Japanese popular culture, which is slightly surprising, given that the majority of the Japanese language learners abroad start nowadays with the primary interest in Japanese popular culture. So in summary, it seems to us that from the 1940s, in the immediate post-war period, the focus has changed from Anglophone Western countries to more diversity in the Western countries, and even more diversity to the whole countries, including Anglophone and non-Anglophone countries, and countries in Asia and other parts of the world, and more of the national understanding of double nationality or political correctness or the equality. And the perspective has changed from American in the US to American traveling to Europe, from Japanese traveling abroad to foreigners traveling to Japan. And finally, in the recent years, we see foreigners living in Japan portrayed in textbooks. So there has been a quite interesting development in terms of the perspective. So we can see that there has been a gradual shift from learning American British culture to showing Japanese culture to foreigners, first visiting, but now living, and we are using all in English language with native speakers and non-native speakers. So we can see this reflection of focus on Japanese identity in terms of this focus on Japanese culture in the textbook, and emphasis on the global human resource can be seen as this depiction of the global diversity with more non-Anglophone countries represented and more Anglophone countries in Asia or other nationality represented. So this is the implication of the in identity formation. We are seeing English from the point of view of Japanese, and Japan as a country to host people from abroad, and history, Japanese culture and history to be learned by foreigners. So this focus is more on Japanese culture seen from outside. And English as a language spoken in many other countries, which takes this idea of word Englishes and variety of English. So this discourse corresponds to more mass media discourse in Japan that we see in recent Japanese society in general. So we have quite a few further questions, such as impact on Japanese ability of speaking English, and this question of, is it appropriate to speak so much of Japan when we learn English? So that is a question raised by Hashimoto about the Japanization of English learner of English, Japanese learner of English. And also this has been this idea of division between us and them, this contrast between us in the Japanese school versus global diversity. So there is a risk of double standard of diversity and conformity. So that's a question that we want to look at in the future. So finally, to ask a couple of questions to Michael. I was wondering, so Michael, you are the South African person living in Japan who have lived in many different countries. And I wonder how you see the current situation in Japan in comparison, for example, in South Africa, which has a very different linguistic situation. And also, as a very experienced EFL teacher in Japan, do you think this reform will have some impact on Japanese language education at the university level? So these are my questions. Thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing the screen.
Thank you very much. Such a complex topic. Could you please
should I go ahead and answer the questions?
Could you please answer them?
All right. So yeah, thank you very much for your presentation, Naoko. Let's see, the first question about comparing the situation in Japan and South Africa. Well, yeah, the countries are indeed very different, right? And the situation is very different in many ways. I think maybe what initially made me interested in this line of research was my impression that in South Africa, most people don't speak English as a first language. It's only maybe 10% of the population speak English as a first language, and we have 11 official languages. So it's a very diverse society. And linguistically diverse as well. But English is the lingua franca in the country. Most people learn English as a second language. And the degree of success, I think, is very high, right? Most people can speak comfortably, and maybe not so much in the rural areas, but in the cities, people who speak maybe Zulu or Xhosa or Afrikaans as a first language usually have no trouble at all communicating to speakers of other languages in English. And I thought it's very interesting because the South African education system is not known for being at such a high level in terms of outcomes as the Japanese system. We have some very good schools, but it's not as equally distributed, right? There's a limited access to high quality education, and in general, the average attainment is very low compared to Japan, right? But most people, even the ones who didn't go to an elite school, can speak English just fine and can watch TV in English and consume media and things like that in English. So that struck me as interesting. Why Japan, this country with this huge developed education system, why can't they achieve the same outcomes in terms of language education? So that's I thought was kind of my starting point that got me interested in looking at the reasons or obstacles that can influence language learning outcomes in different environments. And the second question was about how
impact at the university level
of the new reforms.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's a little bit early to make predictions, I think, because the reforms were supposed to be implemented last year. And they're at elementary school level, so it's going to be a while before those students come see the university campus, right? But I think my personal feeling is that this is probably a good step to introduce more language, more English exposure at an earlier age, because generally, especially things like pronunciation, which is difficult for Japanese monolinguals to learn at a later stage, to distinguish between l and r, for example, which are not distinct sounds in Japanese, and the sounds which don't even exist in Japanese phonology. It's a lot easier for young children to assimilate such sounds at that age than later. And I think just also, I haven't really researched this in depth at all, but from speaking to ALTs who worked, so I was on the JET program as well, working at high school, but I had friends working at elementary schools, and they said, well, it's the kids just absorb the language from exposure much more quickly than at the later levels, and they also have fewer inhibitions at that stage about showing off in front of their friends. My personal feeling is that we'll probably see an increase in communicative competence if these reforms are well implemented. So that's kind of a big if as well, right? Because there are many other factors that might hinder that in practice.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the contrast between situation in Japan and the situation in South Africa is quite striking. And yeah, I'm sure the cultural background is very different, so we can't just compare, but it's very interesting how differently we learn in, languages. And for the second point as well, yeah, so we stay optimistic about this early stage introduction of English education, and you're indeed right that to point out the positive impact on, for example, phonologic aspect of learning language might be much more efficient in early years.
Thank you very much. I think we have a couple more minutes to maybe discuss one more questions. Maybe Michael, do you have any questions to Naoko perhaps?
Yes, I thought a lot of Naoko's findings were very interesting, and it's very interesting indeed to see this this sort of progression over the decades of the content of the English textbooks being focused solely on America at first, and then other Anglophone countries. And as Naoko said, the course of study even explicitly said that children should be taught to imitate the customs of the English speakers. So maybe that could be one question. It wasn't very clear to me. Do the government guidelines suggest that in general, in all aspects of life, the Japanese children should be taught to imitate Western customs, or is it a question of doing so in the classroom so that you can feel more immersed in the language learning? That's one question. Shall I go one at a time?
Sure. So yeah, so in this guideline, they were specifically talking about English classrooms. So in the activities taken in English classrooms, they should follow the British and American customs. But of course, underlined meaning there can be that we should have this mentality of democracy, especially in the post-war period. It was the idea that we will promote democracy like in America, like in the Western countries. So I think there was slight indication of the fact that we should learn how they think, the way they think, and that might be the model. But yeah, in this guideline difference, it was particularly about language classrooms. And I think it sometimes, as it refers to, for example, name order, first name first, last name last, this kind of things included in this customs of American and British culture.
Thank you. And if there's time, the question that I was initially building up to was, it's interesting that over time they've seemed to sort of accept greater diversity or inclusiveness, if you want to use today's terminology, by including people from different ethnic backgrounds and from different national backgrounds, and presenting you know, people with disabilities and all sorts of things are features from the 1990s, you said in the textbooks. And I was so it seems in that way it's kind of very, very progressive or encouraging diversity, but this at the same time with the pushing more of Japanese national identity in the textbooks at the same time, you seem to have this sort of, I don't know if it's a narrower vision of what Japan is like, but I think you use the term us and them, but is it sort of promoting a stereotypical or an essentialistic vision of Japanese people are like this, and like, so we can tell the rest of the world that's very diverse about how Japan is. And so do you get that kind of a feeling? It's in a way, it's, even though it's promoting diversity, it's also stereotyping Japanese culture, at least in a certain way.
Yeah, that was the impression that I had when I looked at the latest textbooks. And of course, the implementation has just happened last year. So this might be the aspect of the textbook that might be developed in the years to come. But for this moment, there have been exactly this portrait of a lot of culture and diversity and key characters in textbooks that represent many different countries, many different backgrounds. At the same time, some of the photos, it was striking to see this photo of the junior high school and elementary school textbook, to see now we are going to junior high school, and this photograph of Japanese students looking very conformist uniform with a very typical Japanese style. And there was no mixed race child, or no child with disability, or no child with different kind of clothes. So it seemed to me that this vision of diversity is something that maybe we are seeing on the screen, and going back to the cinema, we are all the same with a conformist environment. So that was a kind of concern I had when I looked at this textbook, that might have this kind of double standard, with one hand and diversity, on the other hand conformity. So of course, the years to come, that might change, and that would be improved. But for this moment, I see this contrast a little bit of the stereotyping of each country, and as still Japanese students being quite typically conventional and traditional way of behaving. So that was my impression.
All right, thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentations and for the discussion. Thank you for raising this question. I think it's really important for all of us, for learners, for teachers, for speakers of the language who reside in Japan as well. And thank you for coming to listen to our lecture and discussion series on language and identity. Goodbye.